Now tonight, the topic is Writing the Riots. I think that anybody, as old as me, can remember the 1981 riots, but also who was around in this summer. And I have to say, you're a very privileged audience. You obviously hit the right topic. You are about, a quarter of the number of people that wanted to come. It was a huge leap. You have to turn a lot of people away, as we did on first come, first served places. There's obviously something about the long life of the riots, the afterlife of what the riots mean, and what they tell us about us as a society, which people are really engaged in and really interested in what's happening. We've got the most fantastic panel to start discussing, and I really want to focus in a way on how the journalism and writing around the riots may be affecting the way in which we perceive those riots and indeed the kind of policies that governments are producing. We've got a fantastic panel. There's Nick Kent, the creator of documentary theatre at the Tricycle, the man who has turned time after time reporting and people's real words into drama and art, the man that took 12 plays on Afghanistan to the Pentagon. Can't do better than that. And he's got a new play coming out on the riots, which is used Gillian Slovo's interviews with some of the writers. So Nick Kent was the first person that we talked about. Mary Riddell. That was a Freudian slip. I was thinking about it. I'm sure it's familiar to you all from The Guardian, The Observer, but now The Telegraph. She wrote a wonderful piece actually when the riots were on, talking about Cameron needed to think about Tripoli and Tottenham. But she's also, I think, in her journalism, had a very long-term, consistent concern, actually, with young people, with kind of what's going on with people and what's happening around generations, what's happening to young people. So she both wrote, I think, at the time, amazingly about the riots, but also she's got that long-term interest in what's going on. I remember her saying, I think you got on your bike. On your bike?
I did. I got on my bike and went to see what was happening at Tottenham. It is only just down the road, 5 miles. So.
But she's healthy as well. Alex Wheatle is an amazing example of, you always want to bottle it really, arrested in 81, MBE in 2008, but he's written a whole series of extraordinary novels, some of which again have been turned into shows about that experience. Then his life in a sense was, I think, and what he wrote about this summer's events was very much informed by his experience in 81, which is a very direct experience, and we're very, very grateful for him and his writing to be here. And then we've got Paul Lewis, who's leading, he's a distinguished journalist about all sorts of things, but he's also leading this, I think, incredibly innovative, and again it's The Guardian moving into the territory that everybody else is missing out on, this joint project between The Guardian and LSE, doing real research, real proper old-fashioned, I speak as originally a sociologist, a very unfashionable thing to be, real research into what these people were, what their voices were, why they did it, where it's coming from. And he's leading the Guardian side of that really exciting project, but also did a lot of tweeting from the riots, did a lot of writing there. Sorry, I'm sorry. So we've got a fantastic thing. What we're going to do is going to have just 5 minutes really of people saying what they thought it was, and then we'll try and get at what was going on last summer and what it means. I mean, immediately it strikes me that one always individualises poor people's misbehaviour, but rich people's misbehaviour you tend to see as a collective system problem, actually. I think it's quite an interesting feature. So you get bankers, because if they're not individuals, they're part of a system. whereas rioters, because they're individuals who are culpable in a different moral kind of way. So I think that's quite... Mary, what was your view about the meaning and how the writing began to form this experience?
Okay, well, thank you, Jean. Thank you very much for your kind words. And because I've got the unenviable task of going first, I thought you might not mind if I set the riots and the writing and the response into a sort of slightly broader context. So riots in England, in Britain, are nothing new down the centuries. Britons have rioted for freedom, for fairness, for food. These uprisings that began on the weekend of the 6th of August 2011 were in part undertaken for fun. When I floated that idea in a very early column, when we were all sort of scratching around for what the reasons might be, it seemed to me that the notion of the recreational riot might be a bit of a hostage to fortune. But a very recent study, one of the first I think, sponsored by the government and conducted by the National Centre for Social Research. Paul's research, as I'm sure he'll tell us, may have thrown up other findings, but they did put some credence behind that idea. The primary motivation identified by young people involved was that it was something exciting to do, like a wild party or a rave. Other factors were mentioned. Boredom was one, the materialistic society, the opportunity to get free stuff. But the main driver, according to that research at least, was the carnival atmosphere. The party stopped for many of those rioters in the docks of the all-night courts set up to deal with them. Like many journalists, I sat through some of those sessions. I watched as an 11-year-old boy, the youngest rioter, I think, to come before the courts, was dealt with. He had complete composure of an adult as he was dealt with for stealing a waste paper bin. In the adult court, I saw a young scaffolder, fearful that he'd lose his job, who wept in front of the magistrates. He was pleading guilty to the offences of the opportunistic theft of a pair of Lacoste trainers and a body warmer with the tag still on. He asked for to be sentenced that day, and the chairman of the bench refused, saying that such was the gravity of his crime, he had no option but to send him to the higher court for sentencing. The powers that the bench had at its disposal of £5,000 in fines or a 6-month jail term were evidently not enough. The riots left many questions, and I'm sure we'll cover all of them tonight. Why did they happen? What did they tell us about the state of society? How did politicians respond? And what did the riots say about British justice? In the immediate aftermath, David Cameron talked of criminality pure and simple, even though it was obvious that whatever was going on was neither pure nor simple. He also cited the moral collapse which politicians are prone to turn to when any grave event, whether it was the killing of James Bulger or the torching of Foot Locker, disbalances society's certainties and equilibrium. Ed Miliband preferred to single out, to put it the other way round, and say this was a values crisis with its roots in top-down greed. I think that explanation is persuasive, but it doesn't tell the whole story either. The riots, which laid to waste large areas of Britain's major cities, were ostensibly about nothing much, and that makes remedies much harder to achieve. If people riot about food, you feed them. If people riot about over fairness, then there is the option of giving citizens greater liberty. If this time around people had cited a lack of jobs or fairness, that would perhaps have been easier. The Brixton riots were about race, and Scarman tackled just that question. Prison riots almost invariably stem from overcrowding. Harry Wolff, who conducted the major inquiry into such riots, was able to address that crisis. But the British riots of 2011 were to some degree at least about crimes of indolence, undertaken for thrills, for camaraderie, for entertainment, nihilistic impulses, if you like, which make it harder but all the more vital to dissect what was going on. Clearly there's a lack of hope, a lack of jobs, of education, of help for those at risk of failing. The concentration of money among the top 1% and social inequality unrivaled since the 1920s has been focused on by politicians since. The materialistic society, an excuse seized on by young rioters, has also been the subject of politicians' laments, but not necessarily their action. The something for nothing society, I think, is a tag too often aimed at benefit claimants when unearned rewards are more prevalent among the feral rich than among the poor. But to some degree, the riots do show, I think, what happens when people are manipulated to want everything and to expect nothing. All of this will be written about in much more detail, though not necessarily, I think, in the context of the riots. I take Jean's point about concern about the riots lingering, but even so, I think, they proved so ephemeral that it sometimes seems almost as if they never happened. But the consequences are proving more durable, if not always more benign. Take justice, social justice first. The immediate political reaction was to cut benefits, to throw, where necessary, the families of rioters out of their flats and homes. Neither action, I would suggest, would do anything to address the causes. On criminal justice, the appeal court has not reversed in many cases the verdicts reached by the lower courts. For example, to use jailed for 4 years for inciting on social media a riot that never happened have seen their sentences stand. There has, I think, been no final decision on the Home Secretary's wish that children involved in serious crimes should be named and shamed, a move that is contrary to long traditions of justice. Magistrates have won their battle with the Templar. He wanted them to have less powers. They, in fact, have increased their powers, not the jail terms they can impose, but if the criminal justice bill goes through unamended in those clauses, they will have greater powers to fine. If justice were to become less proportionate and a fairer, more productive society remain as elusive, then much would have been squandered and very little learned. There's a division now, I think. Either the riots become, from start to end, a story of waste, futility and mischances, or politicians tackle the causes of the unrest that continues to erupt, be it in student protests or outside St Paul's. The choice is open. That decision has not yet been made. No choice has yet been taken. Thank you.
I'm rather an imposter here because I'm standing in for Gillian Slover, who sadly can't make it tonight. But I'm directing the riots rather than writing the riots. My motive for tackling the riots in any way artistically or looking at them was the fact that the government were not doing a public inquiry on the riots. So my history of running the Tricycle has been to try and use public inquiries and bring them to a wider audience, because I think they have an enormous value. And so I rang Gillian, who was up in Scotland when the riots broke out, and I was in London, and said we should do something about this, because I'm fairly certain the government will not take a public inquiry and look at this properly, which is exactly what happened. They haven't done a public inquiry. Scarman did that brilliant inquiry into Brixton, and the Macpherson inquiry in Stephen Lawrence led to 69 of the 70 recommendations being accepted. So it did change society, I think, fundamentally. Gillian was in Scotland and was looking at it at a great distance and watching it on television, and neither she or I could make head or tail of it. And we thought that doing an inquiry would actually open it out for us and at least bring us to some understanding of what was going on. We interviewed about 35 people over the past month, and it's been amazing how much people want to talk about it. I mean, I've been absolutely flabbergasted that you ring almost anyone and say, what are your views on the riots? And everyone has a view, from rioters, from people in jail who've written to us, from politicians, from community workers who've been very, very valuable giving their take on it, from social commentators, and through to an enormous amount of politicians. And for the first time conducting a play like this, we've actually had access to 2 government ministers who've been willing to give us half an hour of their time to talk about what they think the riots were about. Now, I don't think I've got any easy answers, and I don't think I can contribute. Come and see the play, and you'll hear a lot of different answers in many ways. But the one thing that came very forcibly to us during our research is this definitely, from our point of view and from the research we heard, started as a race riot in Tottenham. The fact is then a lot of people clambered aboard it and took it on in different ways. The way they might have wished to take it on was another matter. But fundamentally, one is watching a huge injustice in this country from a lot of our black and Asian populations who get stop and searched. 8 out of 10 people who are stopped and searched are more likely to be black. They get death in custody. There have been, I think, 80 cases recently within the past 5-10 years of death in custody which have not been investigated. There is no confidence in the Independent Police Complaints Commission from the black community, the Asian community, and many others of us. And these things are just not investigated properly. And the death of Mark Duggan was not actually properly handled in any way whatsoever. The police did not go and inform the family of the death of a relative, which Macpherson, at least under the Lawrence recommendation, said victim support should be there. It wasn't. Then the police refused. When the Independent Police Complaints Commission bundled the inquiry, the demonstration was left without a senior police officer coming to speak to them. The demonstration had gone along in a tongue-in-cheek way to say, we wish to report the death of Mark Duggan, because the police had not had the consideration to go to the family and talk about that. So whatever happened in the riots in general, however they spread thereafter, we do have to look at the injustice that a lot of young black and Asian people are suffering in this country. And that's one of the major lessons I'm very certain that we have to learn. And we should have learned many, many years ago. There are all sorts of disparities between rich and poor. All those things come into it. And I think the dismantling of the welfare state, which we're watching happen, which we can see from the example of what's happened in America recently, those things are issues that we really, really, as a society, have to tackle. And that, I hope you'll come and see the play. It raises those issues. We're doing audience talkback sessions, 3 days a week, where we're actually asking for the views of the audience. And that's what I would find most interesting, to see what people think, because I don't know. I don't know what to think about the riots. I'm very muddled. I know how it started and I know why it started, but what's happened beyond then, I'm not quite certain whether this was a copycat, whether people got off on the adrenaline. People did. There was a sense of carnival. There was a sense of celebration. People have told us that. There was a sense of looking at footballers and saying, you know, they can afford trainers, they can afford these enormously rich things that we just don't have access to. Widescreen televisions, all these sorts of things. And there was a feeling from people that the rich were getting away with all sorts of things, exemplified by what was happening in Parliament, where Gerald Kaufman claims £9,500, £8,500 for a widescreen television, and someone else picks one up in a riot and gets sentenced for 2 years for picking it up in a riot. There is something very wrong with our society, that much I know.
Just to follow on from the Mark Duggan incident, from what I understand, the police released a statement saying that Mark Duggan actually fired the first shot, and now that has been disputed. So I'd like to know, we still don't know who authorised that statement to the press. I don't know, I'm all ears for someone to tell me this. And so that led to the anger in Tottenham on that day, and the subsequent vigil and march to the police station, where they didn't receive a police officer standing to come out and at least speak for them.
Not for 5 hours.
For 5 hours, yeah, which I think led to certain tension and anger. Now, I believe this happened on a Saturday. On a Monday afternoon, it was about 1:30. I live in Lavender Hill in Clapham Junction, and I was doing what I usually do. I was writing something, and my son, he came home from work early, and he went to his laptop, and he was looking at his Twitter and his Facebook and so on. And he said, "Dad, there's lots of messages here that Clapham Junction, Croydon, and so on are going to get hit." And I'm thinking, you know, show me. And he showed me all these messages and his tweets and BlackBerry messages and so on. I thought, wow, you know, I wonder what the police are going to do, because I'm thinking that the police were going to monitor all this information. And so we waited. 2:30, 3:30, 4:30. There's no police in Clapham Junction High Street. No police in Lavender Hill, and where I lived at a police station 50 yards away, just next door to Asda. And up to 6:30, 7:30, no police. And 7:30 was when we heard the first window smash on the High Street and Lavender Hill, the shops there, the Pizza Express and so on. And still no police. And we was all wondering, when are the police going to arrive? By 8 o'clock, the street was filled with youngsters. And when I don't know if you remember the party shop images of Clapham Junction, when that set alight. I actually went downstairs. I live above, in Maisonette's above these shops. I went downstairs because there's youth filling the street, and there was full of adrenaline and excitement, and many of them were young, 11, 12, 13. And I said to them, do you realise there's people living above these shops? And the young guy said to me, yes, we do. Don't worry, we're not going to torch your place. And they were excitable. They had no will or they had no wish to confront the police. Even if they were to be found, I don't think they would have confronted the police. Maybe it might have been different in the Tottenham or the Hackney area, but where I lived, there was no will at all. And they were just having a great, fantastic time, like a night out, like they're playing Tour of Duty. It really was. And we didn't see no police till about 11:45. And I remember BBC London tried to call me up and ask my comments on that, and I said, I'm just trying to make sure that my place doesn't get burned down. And they said, Alex, please, we need to speak to you because you're experiencing the riots. And I put down the phone. But the police came at 11:45. They came with their armoured vehicles and so on, and the looters and the rioters, they dispersed. And then we had all the reaction on the next day, what happened in Croydon and other areas. And then kind of disturbed me that they was picking up, charging people with stealing bottles of water and giving them 6 months. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, wasn't it a year or so ago when Hazel Blears, I don't know how much she managed to get out of the public finances, it was in the grands, I know, and she was just happily writing a cheque on camera, oh, here you are, for my Misty, you know, and I'm thinking, how unfair is that? And I do a lot of work in young offenders institutions and prisons that always ask me to go in and, Alex, talk to these guys, they look up to you, you know, you're a nice example, you know, and I do what I can. And when I do these talks to young offenders and school children and so on, what's been really worried me in the last few years is that the age the age from where a young person might opt out of education is getting younger and younger. At sometimes it's 11 or 12. They say to me, Alex, there's no future there for me. There's no future outside. I talk to young girls, 13, 14, and they just don't believe the simple ideal of owning a detached house in the city with a garden and raising 2.4 children. They think that's unattainable now. And they're not ignorant. These children are not ignorant, even though they live on council estates. They see what's going on in the banking system. They see what's going on in Parliament. They watch. They do engage with politics. They really do. But they're just so dismayed at the way the powers that be have operated. They feel that there's no life for them in regards to work in university, especially with tuition fees and so on. And also, while this is going on, they're hit by all sides from a consumer attack, brand attack. Buy this, you must have this. We become a consumer society. And I think that's really damaged their young to believe, for me to feel normal, I have to have all these trainers and so on. And yet, I do not think that the government actually knows what's going on here with our children, how much they're being brainwashed by them believing that they have to have these luxury goods to feel adequate in some way. And I think that's what led to many of these youngsters attacking the name brand shops. I mean, in Clapham Junction, they hit Phone True Us first. What's the other trainer shop? I think it was JD Sports and so on. They hit to those stores first, And even now, I talk to them again, and they still don't think that this is being properly addressed. That society is unfair. They really believe that, and it's not because they're ignorant. They see what's going on in the world out there. They think it's unfair for them. I mean, they realise now that they would never be living to the standards as their parents or grandparents. They feel outside of the whole government process, and in some ways, I think they've really been, in many ways, I think they have been denied the opportunity to live their life. I mean, no longer do we have the manufacturing base to support them. In 30, 40 years ago, at least, if you didn't go to university, you could maybe work in a factory, work on a car plant or something like that. That is all gone now. So what do we do with these youngsters? This 25%, I think it was, who had previous records of convictions and so on, who took part in the lootings. What are we going to do with these children?
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me too. I'll speak both about the research project that we're working on at the moment, but I thought I would start with how it started for me, really, which was a twit pic of a police car on Saturday, August the 6th at about 9 o'clock. And the police car was on fire, and it was in Tottenham, which is about 10, 15 minutes from where I live. And so obviously I went down to see what was going on at that point. No real suggestion it was a full-scale riot, but a police car on fire, people were starting to talk. And the first thing I encountered in Tottenham was the high road cordoned off and a kind of classic media scene, which is a line of police officers, fire in the background, and then all the kind of cameras with the correspondence, so they could get a bit of police and a bit of fire as well.
We have one behind you.
Oh, there we go. Recreating the image. But, actually nobody, as far as I could tell, doing the obvious thing, which is to kind of walk around the side road and go and see what was happening. And as I did that, I saw people coming past me with suitcases. And I initially thought people were vacating houses which must have been on fire. And then I realised that the suitcases were filled with stolen goods. I thought, I've never seen looting before. This is kind of what it looks like. And it was, everything everyone said kind of, I think, touches on versions of truths in that, yes, there was a kind of this kind of an atmosphere. It was also shocking, people crying as well. Let's not be deceptive here. And I did what I think reporters do, which is now turn to the very easiest and quickest form of communication that we have, which is Twitter, and started kind of, if you like, tweet reporting. And for me, I think it's kind of a journalistic gift, really. It's an entirely new medium. It's very different to what we've had before, where the journalist kind of imparts their knowledge as though they've established the truth of the story in a kind of 600-word article or a 6-minute piece to camera. Because it's one snippet of information and it's a conversation. And that's what's so interesting about it, because you're speaking to people and they're speaking to you back, and they tell you when you get things wrong, and they tell you when your nuance isn't quite right, and they tell you what something looks like from their perspective. So that was happening in Tottenham from the beginning, and I was, sending pictures, witness testimony, quotes, stuff that was happening around me, really, as you would. And then at about 1 o'clock in the morning, went home because it felt like it might be dying down, and again went back to Twitter and saw that the BBC and Sky had pulled out their crews because it was getting too dangerous and they'd been attacked. So there was a combination of both kind of, like a sense of blackout, but also people saying, well, what's actually going on? It's theatrical. Someone did it on purpose. So it's a sense of blackout, but also, just people wanted to know what's happening, and it turned out that actually people had gone to Wood Green, 2 miles west, and Tottenham Hale. So I did what Mary did and got on my bicycle because I knew the roads were blocked, dressed up as a hoodie, and that would be my attire actually for the next 4 days. So for the next 4 days, throughout Tottenham, the next day Edmonton, Enfield, then Hackney, Chalk Farm, Ealing, Camden, and then went to Birmingham and then Gloucester too. So trying as best I can to live this kind of nocturnal life, because the riots were happening at night, of course. Filling the car with lots of food because all the shops would be closed, taking loads of BlackBerry batteries because there was nowhere to charge your phone, and doing a combination of Twitter reporting, but also filing to the live blog and writing longer kind of 2,000-word pieces, doing video and audio, and then also, of course, filing to the live TV channels, because in the middle of the night there weren't many people around. So it was a remarkable experience for me personally, and at the end of it I'd accumulated these 35,000 new followers. And I think follower is kind of a deceptive term, because they weren't just passive. They weren't just kind of reading what I had to say, they were really engaging with it. These people wanted to be part of a kind of collaborative journalistic process. And all the things I said before about correcting you when you're wrong, asking you questions. If I was in a place and wanted to know where the rioting was happening, I would say, ask a question, and ask lots and lots of questions, and people would send you postcodes, direct you to where the trouble was. So it's a massively kind of interactive experience. And then, of course, got to the end of the riots, and we were talking in the office about where do you go now, and obviously you do the kind of big post-mortem. But that was in the context, I think, of 2 things which struck us. One was, as Nicolas Kent said, there was no public inquiry. And the government were really resisting this. So they launched this thing called a victims panel, but it's not, it's talking to communities, which is a valid thing, but it's not a public inquiry. And actually a real reluctance for anyone to seek to explain, I think, because it was almost as though explaining would be kind of, that people were conflating it with excusing at that raw moment immediately afterwards. And let's not forget, left 5 people dead, 2,500 shops looted, mass destruction. It was a bad thing. And I can understand why there was that sentiment, but we thought we needed to do something. And I think in that vacuum, the other thing that struck us was how everybody had a perspective on why it had happened already. No one had spoken to those involved. No one. I didn't see in the days after one good journalistic piece, not in the Guardian or anywhere else, where people had actually spoken to people. Yet everyone thought they knew why it happened or had a view on it. And it was almost as though it was the predictability of it, because people saw it through their own political lens, I think. And that continues today. So then we discovered that in the aftermath of the Detroit riots in 1967, there had been this really interesting project. And a guy called Phil Mayer, who was a journalist, teamed up with a guy called Nathan Kaplan, who was a psychologist at the university. And so Michigan University and the Detroit Free Press teamed up and got some researchers and decided to go out and interview people who were involved in the disturbances. And it was interesting, I think, for two reasons. I mean, one, that they did it, because these types of collaborations don't happen, but also what they found was counterintuitive. So in Detroit, everybody had thought that it was people who'd migrated from the south of the US and were somehow kind of disconnected to the community. But actually they found that those weren't the people who were writing. It wasn't new migrants to the city. And it was much more connected with housing. And the fact that they found something that nobody anticipated, I think, was really exciting for us. So I tried to think, well, can we do something similar? And we needed money, and we needed an academic partner. And we got the best, I think, academic partner we could find, which was Tim Newburn, who leads the social policy department at the London School of Economics. He's a brilliant academic. He's been doing this for 30 years, criminal justice, and this area of sociology. And we got some generous funding from Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Open Society Foundation. And then we constructed this research project. So the meat of the project is to do what I think hasn't been done, which is to interview people directly involved in the disturbances. These are qualitative and quantitative interviews, but mainly qualitative, right? So mainly people telling us without us leading them, but also some structured questions, attitudinal stuff, to get a sense of the demographics as well. And we asked people who were connected to the communities if they would act as researchers, because we wanted people who would get people to talk. That's really key. And we put an application on the website and had 450 people apply in just a few days. Decided who to interview. We interviewed a few, I think about 60, and whittled them down to about 30 researchers. And for the month of October, they were in London, Birmingham, Nottingham, Liverpool, and Manchester, speaking to those directly involved, and only directly involved. We weren't so keen on people who were observers, because they're very keen, easy to talk, really. But the difficult thing is people who were involved. And we're now in the fieldwork stage. So we've finished the fieldwork stage. We're now into the analysis phase. And regrettably, I can't tell you exactly how many people we've spoken to, but if you think in the Detroit project, they spoke to 45 writers. And in the Cabinet Office research that was mentioned, they spoke to about 60. Yep. If you add those two numbers together, a lot more. And we're really, really chuffed, actually, because it was really hard work to get people to speak, because they're essentially admitting, in large parts, to sometimes really, really serious crimes. And journalists aren't used to people saying that to them. So we have now this massive information about the riots from the perspectives of the people who were directly involved. Tangentially, there was a lot of talk about Twitter as a kind of an organising, potentially, did it have an organising role in the riots, but also the riots were kind of seen through the lens of Twitter. So we spoke to Twitter, and they gave us a database of 2.5 million tweets, and said, look, you can analyse this, and that's what we've been doing too with the help of Manchester University. So we feel like we're kind of looking at the story as a whole, and this is only the first phase. There'll be a second phase in the next few months. And like I said, it would be lovely to speak to you about all of our findings, but I can't scoop our publication, which I hope will be in a few weeks' time. But what I think I can say is I think that we have got lots of it wrong, actually. And that's really satisfying. I think we'll have a lot to say on social media. People might not expect us to say what we do. Similarly on gangs, similarly on deprivation, issues of deprivation. Something that really, it's not a finding per se, but has really struck me when I read through all of these transcripts, is the diversity of motivation, for a start. There cannot be one singular kind of reason why people get involved in a disturbance like this. But the other thing that you get kind of loud and clear is a sense of empowerment, that people really felt that this was them executing a kind of power that they wouldn't normally have. Not necessarily in a positive way. That sings through, vast majority of the transcripts. And there's a lot we'll be saying, I think, about police too, and relations with police. And it strikes me that when we have I would love to know actually when we've had historical riots in the past, and they've been described as a race riot, or they've been given, we say, well, the Gordon riots was because of X. Now, how long after the riot is that meaning given to it? And I wonder whether there will be a kind of defining description or meaning that we give to this, and it wouldn't be for us to do. I think for us, what we're doing and what I hope we can do well is simply do what, and this is the great thing, journalism and academia share this objective, which is to find out the truth, or a version which is as close as you can get to it, really. And so that's the process we're in. It's massively exciting, and I hope, you know, come early December, you'll all be reading The Guardian.
All of those people, I almost want to say false consciousness, but another word that I've said, that people do things not knowing why they do them, under pressures they don't understand.
And then don't you think you also get the sort of post-hoc rationalisation? You know, I think a lot of this material stuff, and Paul obviously will know this far better from the research he's done, but you sort of feel that people walked away with the widescreen telly and then kind of thought up the line a little of the fact that Jared Kaufman had got one just like that, but, you know, the penalty he'd paid would be considerably less. And also, I think your point about people seizing on the groups that they thought might be to blame is very interesting, because, you know, it was all about gangs, wasn't it? And then suddenly it wasn't all about gangs, and it was all about race. And while I absolutely take the point about the police and the mishandling of the Mark Duggan element, you know, I mean, that was disgraceful, and it's certainly all the points you made, Nick, about the stop and search and all the rest of it, and the disproportionate number of black people in the criminal justice system and all that is absolutely true. But you do sort of feel that at the same time race was only a small factor in perhaps in the wider picture. I mean, the courts I sat in, it was only a snapshot one day in court, but there were almost no black people at all. The defendants of all ages were predominantly white. And anyway, I just think that's why the research you're doing is going to be so hugely valuable, because of course politicians read whatever they want into it. I happened to be in the Newsnight studio when Harriet Harman and Michael Gove were having their great sort of set to about whether it was the cuts or not. And I think that sort of slightly put people off talking about the financial pressures. And it does seem to me that if there is perhaps a unifying thread in this, it's that economic failure and social failure are pretty close allies.
I would agree with that. I think, I mean, I was only saying the kicking off, I think, was a racial thing in Tottenham. And it's interesting, Paul mentioned it's counterintuitive. I mean, we interviewed Ian Duncan Smith 10 days ago, and he was absolutely obsessed with being a gang culture. And, you know, then 2 days later, there was the report from the Home Office saying it absolutely wasn't. And you thought, how can you get this so wrong? And there's a lot of that going on. But I think there's a lot of feeling which goes across race barriers, of the have-nots feeling we're getting our own back. And the people we interviewed, an enormous amount of people felt they'd been abused in some way, or their family had been abused in some way at some time, either by the government, who was taking away the EMA or about to, or there was youth unemployment of 1 million people, or by the police. In some way, the state, this was their chance to get back at the state. And I think that had, I mean, from the evidence we've got, that seemed to be a common theme that was running through everything.
But I mean, it seemed to me that the contrast with 81 is a rather odd one, in the sense that 81 was definitely against the police. I mean, I think what you might say about this block, if only the police had had their act together, not so many young people would have been arrested. I mean, it seems to be almost the opposite, really. That
we didn't dare to be on the streets.
Yes, it was a failure of policing, which had terrible consequences.
I think that was political, because just before, I think a few weeks before, maybe a week before or so, the announcement of police cuts came about.
Yeah.
And so I think it was political the way the police
deliberately
stood back. But definitely 81. I remember on the Friday evening when the skirmish happened in central Brixton with the young guy who everyone believed was stabbed by the police in broad daylight, and that was something like wildfire.
Yeah.
None of us went to bed that night. We went from house to house, estate to estate, saying to ourselves that we cannot take no more of this. We have to stand up. And so that's why on a Saturday morning we went to Brixton en masse with the intent of confronting the police. And looting was just secondary. That came as a result of a confrontation with the police. In fact, during the whole day, I wasn't even aware that there was looting taking place in the high street, because I was
In 81, you mean?
in 81, yeah. So this is where it did differ, even though the same social circumstances are there, with deep cuts and youth unemployment, which is what, over 1 million now, which we seem to be off the ball of that now. You know, no one's really addressing that or making the government accountable for that. I think that figure is a disgrace. I really do, and it leads to lack of hope and dismay.
I mean, it was interesting that we've interviewed 3 serving police officers, all of whom were involved in Tottenham, all of whom said that PC Blakelock, they mentioned somewhere in the interview they were worried because of what had happened to PC Blakelock. The memory of that in the police force is there, and to some extent, I mean, one of them said he was worried that he was there to protect the public, he was worried someone would get killed, that's why they didn't intervene. But also he was worried that if he pushed one of his officers forward to intervene, they might get killed or injured. And I'm certain that what happened on Broadwater Farm those many years ago was still in the back of people's minds in the policing of that riot initially.
Wearing another hat, I quite recently chaired something on Northern Ireland, and it's very interesting where riots didn't happen. And of course in Belfast, which usually riots like anything, they didn't riot. This didn't spread there, and I said, well, why didn't it spread there? And they said, oh, well, we're very moral in Belfast. We only riot about serious things, but but also actually it was seen as an indicator, oddly, of Belfast feeling very separate from the mainland. But I mean, there are the places where the riots didn't spread to.
I think that is fascinating, and there were attempts to get riots going in some very strange places.
Yeah, Stroud.
Yeah, Jersey, parts of the Medway, parts of the Thames Valley. There was an Asda broken in Huddersfield. I mean, and it would be fascinating. We're doing it, trying to find out why that didn't turn into something bigger.
Yes.
What was it? But also to really drill down into the geographical differences,
Yes.
because I think we have come up with a label, the riots. Sure, easy, journalists love it, but it doesn't properly describe what was happening across the country, because certainly in some parts they were riots. In other parts there wasn't really rioting. It was just sustained looting. I mean,
yes.
I remember going to some parts of North London, and it was just kind of warehouses that had been prized open and all of the stuff taken out, and then they would go to a big retail park and similarly do the same thing. Now, is that a riot? I don't know. I mean, I think lots of people assume rioting involves some kind of clash with police or some kind of arson or destruction.
It was theft.
Well, it was theft. It was many
stuff.
things. Yeah.
It was stuff.
But then, the subsequent night, Hackney, there was no looting at all. It was simply the Battle of Pembury Estate. So people just wanted to fight police, and they wanted to protect the area, seal off the streets and claim territory. Similarly, Birmingham, whereas in London people were causing destruction within their own communities, in Birmingham people kind of descended into the city centre. Similarly in Manchester too. Manchester, Moss Side wasn't really involved. Salford was massively. So the more black community wasn't, the white community was. Nottingham, firebombing of police stations, again, very little looting. So these are fascinating differences, I think, between all of them. We have to ask why some places and not others. And we also have to ask why in some ways in some places, I think.
Yeah. And why yes.
No, just to add a very small sort of anecdote. We spoke to Karen McCluskey, who deals with gangs in Glasgow, and we asked her why were there no riots in Glasgow, and she said everyone was so depressed in Glasgow they didn't aspire to getting good trainers any longer.
Thank you very much. I don't think we've got a microphone. I'd very much like to open this up We have a microphone, thank you. If you'd like to, what I'll do is I'll take 3 or 4 questions, I'll take a couple of rounds or 3 or 4 questions. Anybody, questions? If you'd like to say who you are, keep it brief. Any more? One? Any more? One? I feel like an auctioneer. Roger, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this side can go again. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right.
Hi, I'm Christina Patterson from the Independent. Oh, I need a- I'm Christina Patterson from the Independent. This is really responding to you, Mary, and your point about race, well, which everyone's kind of touched on. But I don't know how reliable the figures are, but my understanding is that 55% of, I'm not sure if it was the convicted, people so far convicted for their involvement in the riots were black or mixed race, which, given that the percentage nationally is less than 4%, is pretty high. So it would seem to me, I mean, I actually wrote a column about this at the time, but it would seem to me that it is a complicated issue clearly, and the Mark Dudley thing clearly was a trigger, but I don't think we can ignore that statistic. So I just really wanted to throw that into the mix. Roger.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Roger Grave. I'm a criminologist and a filmmaker, and I made the film about Keith Blakelock, who killed Keith Blakelock, and also I'm an advisor to the Met on race and IAG, and so we had our own evidence from this, and I thought it might be just interesting, and I don't know if your research had covered this, but the event, the killing of Mark Duggan, happened on a Thursday. In the gym in Tottenham on Friday, people were making plans to do something about this. The IPCC handled it incredibly badly. They had no idea what to do about it. All that stuff you were saying were right. But on Friday, the plans were starting. And one of the things I found really interesting was that the people who were organizing to go to Croydon, for example, all the way across London, they hired vans. They actually hired vans. And they stopped at red lights. And they did, people who went by tube would pay their fares and so on in order to get to the point where they were then going to take things. And I just found that very interesting. And the other, just to mention about the 81 riots, that the looting, both in Liverpool and in the race thing, absolutely starts it and drives it. But then the looting, particularly by white people, came in Brixton. Half the people who were arrested in Brixton in 81 were white. And when it started as an anti-police riot, absolutely racist stuff, became a looting excuse. Same thing happened in Liverpool, same thing happened in Manchester. And so my own view, actually, is with Mary on the sense that I thought it was a kind of orgy of excitement and greed. And the people that you've left out of this, I think, was the BBC, because the BBC coverage all through that time showed the Croydon furniture warehouse on fire. And whatever the report was, that was the background, like this image here. And I think that fed the excitement. And I was just wondering the degree to which you felt the coverage was itself self-fulfilling. I mean, I don't know, Paul, whether that fits with your hearing, but I certainly thought that was stirring things up, and I was very upset about it.
There.
Hi, my name is Camilla Schick. I used to work for the Media Science Trust. I just wondered, for anybody in the panel who's actually spoken, who's done a lot of speaking firsthand to people in the riots, whether they feel that it's mainly the erosion of civil liberties, the kind of stop and search, the incessant stop and search from police, mainly on the Asian and black community, but perhaps also just on youth in general, disaffected youth, whether they felt that was the main reason for the backlash against the police, or whether it was more the erosion of the state welfare, because it seems to me that there's a bit of a contrast there, that one is erosion of civil liberties from the last government, and then this government is more the erosion of the state welfare, so there's a bit of a clash there between the two governments. I was just wondering what feedback was from the people in the riots.
The reasons are very complex. You can't just lay it onto one mask. I mean, for instance, black children are more likely to be excluded from schools. Black people are more likely to be in one-parent families, and all these other issues that feed into that. I think it was 25% of the rioters who had previous convictions. And so I'm sure with your research, you will feed all those aspects in and come out with some detail that we can debate about then. But I think it's maybe a bit too early to maybe try and understand the question.
My my instinct on that would, and it's only that because I've got no evidence at all, that it's much more likely to be the erosion of state welfare. And Nick made the point that it would be the worst thing you could do at the moment is to start dismantling the welfare state. And yet I think that is the first political reaction. You know, these people aren't behaving well, so chuck them out of their homes and cut some benefits and apply sort of incentives that way. And it just seems to me that this is a story at some quite sort of deep level of disadvantage. And of course, after the great crash in the 1920s, the welfare state was formed and so on. And then the inequalities in society really did start to narrow for a while, and obviously they've widened enormously since then. Just very quickly on Christina's point on race, I mean, I don't, I absolutely, take those figures. I hadn't heard that figure. Equally, my day in court, as I said, was purely a snapshot, not representative of anything. However, I would expect the 55% or whatever it was of black and mixed race people convicted to be higher than one would expect from the relative levels of population, given that I think there is definitely a sort of predisposition to round up, slam in the cells and bring to court people who are black and of mixed race. So I think you've got to sort of unpick those figures. And also I think Roger's point about the white looters was absolutely correct and very interesting too. And also the fact that the BBC, along with almost all the establishment, came out of this very badly. The police, politics, the media, almost nobody in authority. Sorry?
I was going to say there was no plan. What
No
was so
plan.
extraordinary about it?
And also
it was actually rather a predictable event in a funny kind of way, and there didn't seem to be, endlessly people sit around in civil emergency meetings, planning for this and that, and there didn't seem to be, the police didn't have a strategy, the government didn't have a strategy.
I don't know if you can have a plan or a strategy for something like this. I mean, this was the biggest, most serious bout of civil unrest in a generation. It was happening, okay, if you go back to 81, people say Brixton tops it, but actually it happened in other places as well, far less reported, but all around the country, similarly to this. So it wasn't unique in that sense, but the role of, I'm not going to say social media because I think that's to conflate various issues, but BBM technology specifically was really instrumental. I would just like to mention briefly on the race point, because I think it's an important one, because people talk about it. I'm not sure how important it is beyond that. Those 54%, as Mary said, these are arrestees. So it's not a picture of those who were involved in the disturbances, it's a picture of those who were subsequently arrested. The MOJ, when putting out those figures, also put out figures for the racial makeup by area. And they did things like, say, disproportionately black in Harringay, in Tottenham. And they compared the makeup of the arrestees in Tottenham to the racial makeup of the borough. But that includes Muswell Hill and Enfield. Now people from those areas weren't involved in that part of the disturbance. So it's kind of a crude way of looking at it, I think. If we were to be slightly crude ourselves and think of some generalisations that speak to who was involved, they were generally young. I mean, not exclusively. I think, from memory, the youngest we've interviewed is about 13, 12. The eldest, maybe about 62. So a whole range, but definitely mostly young. They were also mostly men. I think we've completely failed to unpick the role of women in all of this, because we've underplayed the extent to which they were present, and also we've generally categorised this as kind of angry young men, but the involvement of women is really interesting too. But generally, yes, so young, male. But the one other thing that you can say from those MHA stats, but also from our demographic data, I think, is that they were generally poor. And that's the single thread, is the social deprivation element. Now, that doesn't speak for everyone, of course, but that's the one thing that you can say about people who I think were involved.
Could I take all up just on one point?
Yes.
Is that Tottenham was unique, I think, Paul, in one way, in that what we saw on the media and what the people saw on the ground was the police were holding back. Now, in a riot in Britain, on mainline mainland Britain. We've never seen that before. And I think that was a cause of the copycat rioting, because people thought, oh right, the police are not going to stop us, we can just break in and take what we want. And a lot of people we interviewed have said to us they were amazed the police held back.
But I wonder, when I say, just very quickly, when I say what's the plan, and I respond to this point in this way, when you have, as was the case in Tottenham, 50, 60 police officers and a few thousand people, what are they going to do? And similarly, in the following day in Enfield and Hackney and elsewhere, massively outnumbered. They were thinking primarily about protecting themselves. As I think you rightly identified, Blade Block was there in the consciousness, but I saw police officers genuinely nearly get killed as well, again. And I think if they had been more proactive in times, they would have been killed, without a doubt.
Can I take another? There's somebody there. Never. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we just keep it up. Yeah, right at the back.
Hi, my name is Bill Swainson. I'm an editor at Bloomsbury Publishing. And I want to just pick up on something that we talked about a couple of times, but not as, if you like, as part of the story, which is the quality of journalism. I want to give one instance, particularly from the BBC, which was, I think, the Tuesday or the Wednesday afterwards. There was an instant half-hour panorama programme, which is a complete travesty of any kind of objective journalism at all. That's my personal opinion. And I'd like to get some sort of sense of what the panel thinks about how the journalism contributes, or the quality of the journalism contributes to the story and the way it's reported, and how it then becomes part of a national sense of what's gone on.
Jasmine.
Hi, it's Yasmin Alvar-Brown from The Independent. Two things, I do think the race thing is a very important part of the jigsaw. And one of the problems at the moment, I just don't think we can say these were arrestees. We don't have a national conversation anymore about race. It's sort of not there. And I think that's something I wanted to put in. But I live in Ealing, and I interviewed a lot of people when the sentencing started. And what was very interesting was when the riots were happening, and I think the BBC again, were running this woman who runs a little shop. She's actually thieving, charging £60 for a baby grow, but that's another point. And everybody, including my young teenage girl, had a daughter, had become incredibly angry with the young people who had been out, using words like feral and animals and so on. And so there was a divide. But I then went out when the sentencing had started and temperature had gone down a bit. And what was very interesting, how many people said, they said that these young people were only interested in things, that the judges have put them in prison for things, for just taking things. So what's the difference? So the sentencing is producing another reaction, is what I wanted to say.
For fairness, I'm trying to go in order.
I wanted to make something like the same point. These, as you said, the people who were doing this were largely poor. They couldn't afford the things they were taking. What they were taking was enormously inflated price trainers, which had been made by children on starvation wages in Nepal. They were taking laptops and mobile phones, which were using materials like coltan dug up by people on starvation wages, if any wages at all, in the Congo, in conflict materials which have caused 5 million deaths. Now that's the society we're living in. And as far as the sentencing is concerned, this is a reflection of what happened during the Gaza demonstration in February 2009, which I was on, which the police caused deliberately a riot. And the people who were subsequently sentenced after that riot and knocked up in the middle of the night and taken away all of the people who were actually sentenced to prison were Muslims, in spite of the fact that everyone involved was people from all over, all different religions and none. And the people who actually went to jail were all of them Muslims after that demonstration. That's the society we're living in today.
Hi, I'm Rachel Shabby. I write more on the Middle East, less on the riots. As a result of which I had contacts in places like Egypt call me at the time saying, what's up with your uprisings? Well, it was really interesting to hear the four of you talk and the stuff that you were all talking about. But we're talking about writing the riots, and when I was watching them the first few days, the TV and media analysis and on Twitter, it seemed like the media was really showing its colours, in that it seemed very distant and very elite, and therefore incapable of kind of really understanding what was going on, with a few worthy exceptions. Mary Riddell, I thought you were one of them. And I just wonder, with the situation getting worse in terms of media likely to be less diverse, if anything, what can be done to counter this? It'd be really interesting to see what you've got to say. I mean, you mentioned social media and Twitter as a way of encouraging a conversation. Does that dissipate this problem, or does it just exacerbate it? Just your thoughts on that.
Oh, one behind.
Hi, my name's Ralph. I work at the think tank Demos. Basically, we've spoken a little bit about politicians' reactions to the riots, but we haven't really spoken that much about the public at large and what their views on it were. I thought it was quite interesting that some of the politicians' reactions actually seemed to garner some public support. So the idea of throwing people out of their their kind of council housing or cutting people's benefits if they're involved in the riots actually seemed to get some support on social networks. And I was wondering if, those are the early indicators. I was wondering if once the temperatures dropped, people have changed their minds on that, or if there's any evidence on that whatsoever, basically. Because I'm a bit worried it might kind of change political attitudes more broadly in the UK.
Didn't the media have a part to play in whipping up that hysteria? We must crucify these young people and so on.
It's any other question, and I'll go back to I think there's one more, and I'll go back to you.
Hello, my name's Tom. I work at the LSE. I was wondering, there seems to be a distinction between rioters and looters made by some of the panel members and in the press. Do you think this distinction is useful or warranted in any which way? So I just wondered if you could make some comments between them.
Well, just to take up Bill's point and Rachel's about the role of the media in all this. I do think, as Roger said earlier, that the media have been were responsible in this story, as in many others, in keeping the whole ball rolling, in putting up hysteria and so on. So clearly they're a part of that. To some extent, that's sort of unavoidable. You report something, you put it. You put it out there, and if there is some sort of crisis going on, then it's likely to feed off that coverage too. I think the difficulty with the media is that journalists really don't get out nearly as much as they should do. And for every journalist like Paul, I love the image of you in your hoodie, kind of biking around the riots, which in my view is exactly what you should be doing. There will be a whole lot more journalists and columnists, which I am particularly guilty of this, kind of sitting in their offices or sitting in their studies and thinking up all sorts of spurious reasons why this might be going on, sort of tuning into the television and seeing the sort of coverage that again Roger spoke of, but actually not getting anywhere near real people, real riots or any of that. And I think there is a danger that will actually get worse. Newspapers are very short of money, they're short of resources, and actually it's very, very inspired, but quite a luxury too, for the Guardian to take an eminent reporter like Paul, take him off diary and just say, go and cover this in your own way, rather than trying to get sort of as much sort of bang for their buck as they possibly can, while also dictating the agenda. Just a very quick point on sentencing. I think Yasmin raised this and somebody else too. But I do think that the courts made far too little distinction, and unfortunately the appeal court, it seems to me, has not yet rectified this, and indeed may not, made far too little distinction between vicious rioting and opportunistic looting. The kind of sad kid who comes along and takes not even a flat screen telly or even a pair of Lacoste trainers, but just some daft thing, just a trophy to say that they were there. And I think the courts were very, very prude in that application. I think they, magistrates, certainly had a political battle to fight as well, just as the police did in a certain way. And I think it's a very great shame that that hasn't been remedied.
It's difficult because I think the media is, of course, imperfect. And I kind of think that the media in the UK responded as we all would have expected to the riots. I mean, it's quite predictable how each of the news organisations covered the story. I mean, I do wonder whether we overvalue comment and undervalue just humble reporting sometimes. Sorry, I mean, I have one. I have a few anecdotes of the riots, but one that kind of I think speaks to this was I was in Edmonton and walking along on the phone to Radio 5 Live, and they had a group of commentators, and I think someone was blaming it on EMA. There's an MP saying this is brutality via Twitter. There was someone else doing a kind of feral underclass line, and they got me on from the ground in Edmonton, and just by coincidence I was walking along and I saw a guy on a wall surrounded by some young girls, and you could see instantly that something really bad had happened just by looking at their faces, and they were like, he's stabbed. And the poor guy had been stabbed in the arm in quite a bad place actually. And I kind of, I don't know why I did this, but I kind of said it over the line. I said, look, I'm sorry, I've just encountered a young boy. Well, I say young boy, I said he was a teenager, about 17, and I'm in Edmonton, and he's just been stabbed. And the guy who was the anchor at the time said, sorry, that's unconfirmed. I just thought, what has to happen? True. Drove me mad, and then I kind of heard them zoning on about all the things that they thought the riots were about. But we are imperfect, and I think we have fed into a general misunderstanding of why this happened. I mean, most of our interviews have been qualitative, as I said, but we have had some structured kind of polling type questions. And really interestingly, we polled what do you think are the causes of the riots, and listed all the possible causes nationally, and then asked people who were directly involved what they thought. And you compare these two graphs, complete opposite. What the general public think were the main causes, rioters completely disagree. And I think that probably says something about media distortion. Of course, it's important to distinguish rioter and looter. And there is a very, very thin, invisible line between someone who's observing and someone who just kind of participates. So, another thing I remember very quickly was on the first night in Tottenham, people were using stacks of bottled water to defend their shop windows. And one of these bottles of water sprawled all over the floor, well, a few of them had, and I was really thirsty, there were no shops open, and it was just a bottle of water, and I just thought I could just pick this up right now. And I could have, but, cop sees it, no Orwell Prize, 6 months in prison.
Alex?
I just believe the media response, sometimes the media should be careful of what they wish for. Especially as a first time, someone who's committed a crime for the first time, say it's stolen, I don't know, a TV or something like that. And this young person might be in a very good position, a good job. And all of a sudden, they're caught up in their assignment and their adrenaline, and they get 6 months, a year, whatever. And now that person does their time, they come out, it'd be so much more difficult for that person to get a job. So much more difficult to then get a footing into the world. And so they're going to make a decision. whether this is not for me, I'm going to follow this road now, I'm going to be a hustler, whatever. I mean, I made a decision myself. I know what it's like to be in that position where is society for me or isn't it for me? Should I try to do what society demands of me, or shall I, it's rejected me, so I'm going to do this? And so we have to be very careful about what we wish for these young people. I'm not speaking about those youngsters who set places alight and their lives. I'm talking about the opportunistic loot or whatever. We should be very careful to criminalise them, and sometimes I think the media response to that was over.
I think I'd like to bring it to a close now. I think it's been absolutely splendid discussion, and actually I think you get left with the sense that actually The Guardian and some of these writers are doing what the government curiously didn't fail to do in 81. Well, that's really quite interesting. In 81, the government response with Willie Whitelaw was, this is serious, we've got to find out why it's happening. And there's actually a real failure this time to recognise that there is something that has to be found out. And but I think some of these journalists and some of these, some of the work that reporting and writing is doing, and all of these things and the play are, in a sense, moving in where government has failed to take this on. And I'd also like to thank you very much for being actually tremendously well informed and interesting audience. So thank our panel.